In today's episode, I'm going to read out this Marlin page. If I did, would you watch it? So the main point of this episode isn't really M420 directly, but more about how M420 interacts with its related codes. Because M420 is mostly used to make the bed mesh work, and the instructions are to just stick this one line into your start code. But what does that one line do? Why does it do it? And what happens if you leave it out? So I am going to read a bit of this. Get and or set bed leveling state. For mesh-based leveling systems, use a Z parameter to set the Z fade height. Interesting. Anyway, for the ABL uninitiated, ABL means auto bed leveling. 2 L's if you want to spell it correctly, I'm just saying. Auto bed leveling, at its very simplest, consists of storing a measurement of where the center of your bed is in the Z direction. Optionally, but usually referring to it being combined with some kind of stored mesh of values for the printer to know the height of your bed in somewhere between maybe 3 and 100 individual points, depending on how it's set up. As you can see, there's at least 5 different ways to level a bed, but I think most of the time these days we use one of these 3. Bilinear is the most common, I think, on stock machines. I'm not sure I've seen anything else used when combined with an automatic bed probe. Manual refers to when you do it yourself with paper without a probe. Yes, that is a thing, but it tends to be a thing you have to build Marlin yourself for, in my experience. I think there's very few machines that come with that capability. FlashForge, I think. But it's also better than you might imagine. I use a manual mesh on Janet here because I just haven't bothered to fit a BL Touch, and I think it works really well. It arguably works as well, possibly better, than using a BL Touch on this printer. That is very much a case of personal opinion. Now, notably, UBL works differently and doesn't necessarily use M420, although it still works if you do use it, so it's kind of out of the scope of this video, but I can poke at it later in a separate episode if there's interest. If you're using UBL, you probably already know what you're doing to some extent. Also, this video is very Marlin specific. Other firmwares might support some of the codes but work quite differently. So, what does M420 do in all this? You see, once you've made your mesh by whatever method you choose, then Marlin doesn't automatically use it. At least normally. We'll get to that. So that means in practice you could spend ages creating a mesh and making sure to store it on your printer, slice your model in Cura, and your first layer looks awful. This is because on stock Marlin, and this is where it gets confusing because reasons, but on stock Marlin you need to explicitly load the mesh. Or not, because, yeah, this is why it's confusing. I will demonstrate with some examples, and I'll see if I could throw a badly drawn flowchart in at the end too. In this start code here, we do a G28 home command. G28 just finds where the home of X, Y, and Z are by touching the switches, or, whatever method your printer uses. This start code will not use a mesh because nowhere in here have you loaded or probed a mesh before printing, and if we just turn the printer on or reset it without having made a mesh, then there may well be a mesh stored on the printer, but obtusely it will not use it. If you wanted to use a stored mesh here, you would invoke M420. Importantly, you have to do this after G28 unless you want to lose it again, because yes, the G28 home command disables bed leveling. Why? No idea, probably just to trip people up. It's all too easy to accidentally G28 after you've M420'd and, again, not use your mesh and perhaps not realise it, so that is a common pitfall. So here's method number 1, G28 in your start code and then M420, in this case M420 S1. The S1 parameter on M420 seems to cause a lot of confusion, and I have seen some fairly crazy explanations as to what it does, but in their defense, it's particularly unclear in the documentation. The S parameter for M420 appears to mean activate or enabled. If you just use a plain S, it's equivalent to S1, so M420S and M420S1 are equivalent. I thought that S was choosing a slot, so S2 would choose slot 2, but it does not appear to work like that. It's not the same for S used in other commands like G29, where that is the case. So pretty much if you're using M420, you're using M420S1. You might as well just memorize it as one command and not worry about why it's M420S1, it just is M420S1. Indeed, if you're interested, M420S0 disables the mesh, which has a specialist use case, I guess, that we'll get to. We'll also discuss the other parameters in a second. Method number 2 for setting up an auto bed mesh, and the word auto is important here because this normally wouldn't work for manual mesh, or at least it's not logical to use it, is to reprobe the entire mesh every time you do a print. To do this, you would invoke the G-code command G29, which is the command to make a mesh. This is the one your printer's menu is probably using. Normally you would choose a bare G29 with no parameters, as the defaults to use are set up in the Marlin configuration when it was compiled, but there are quite a few parameters you can invoke if you so wish. Using G29 creates the mesh in RAM, as Marlin puts it, but it doesn't store it in EEPROM, and I suppose I need to explain the difference. What Marlin calls RAM is volatile working memory. Volatile meaning that it will not react with air, but that it will disappear if you remove the power from the microchip. EEPROM stands for electronically erasable I can't remember, but it's a non-volatile block of memory that a microcontroller could store stuff in, and these days chips have a relatively large amount of EEPROM, so it's not really an issue. So what Marlin really means by this is that the results of G29 just aren't saved, they're just used as is on that occasion. Of course, if you want to save them, then you can issue an M500 command, which is literally store current settings to EEPROM. And it's worth mentioning that this stores all current settings to EEPROM, not just your leveling data. So if you've been messing around with anything else like acceleration or jerk, then it will write that too, and you might not want that to happen. But we digress. Normally, if you want to level for every print, there's no huge reason to store that mesh after you G29. You would just use it, and then you would make a new one next print, and so on. So G29 normally would be used in isolation. And importantly, after G28, as we already said, because homing the axes is both necessary when making the mesh and it wipes any loaded mesh. We just covered that. Method number 3 is to use a lesser known parameter in your Marlin configuration, and by configuration I mean when you compile it yourself. The parameter in question is restore leveling after G28, which, as you might guess by the name, is the literal equivalent of sticking an M420 S1 after a G28. Which, to remind you, because we've been throwing around a lot of G-code, is to load a stored mesh command. I actually quite like this, and I think a few printers have this by default too. The problem is knowing that it's doing that. I think the Neptune 3 does, for example, in its Marlin build. The upside of this is that you can use any old start code with or without a load mesh command in it, and it will load the mesh when you home the G28 command, which you would use the G28 command because you can't print without homing the axes. If I had a print farm, this would be something I would probably be interested in. So aside from any weird configurations, I think that sort of explains how this stuff works. I hope it clears it up a bit. I also think it would be worth having a look at the parameters of M420 a bit closer, but there aren't really that many of interest. The main one is V, which will spit out the current mesh into your console window, as you can see. This is quite useful. There's also the Z one that I mentioned at the beginning. Probably best to leave it as is, but it exists. That could be a discussion for another time. Let me know what you think, and also let me know if you are interested in going into G29 manual auto unified leveling as a separate episode, because there's quite a bit there that could be covered. Otherwise, I will see you next episode. Thank you for watching.